Hello and welcome to the programme in which I travel to meet the most remarkable people in the Asia Pacific and beyond.
It's been lovely meeting you.
We spend time with the biggest names in Hollywood and the legends of Indian cinema too.
I love you.
You're here talking to me, aren't you?
We see a different private side to public lives, whether it's touring the outback with Australia's top singing group or playing beach cricket with Dennis Lillee, arguably the greatest fast bowler of all time.
Over square leg. 4.
3 clear for takeoff.
We get to know the Asia-Pacific's most influential business leaders, spend time with royal families, and discover the people making the Asia-Pacific the most dynamic region on Earth.
It's all part of an overall master plan.
It's a nice personal touch.
It is a nice. This week I'm in Singapore. Now, this country, of course, has been one of the great global economic success stories of the last, 40 years or so. But I've come to see a local best-selling author who is very witty, very outspoken, and one of her government's harshest critics.
Catherine Lim has written 5 best-selling novels, 9 collections of short stories, and 2 poetry collections. And yet, at the start of her career, her publisher refused to print her work in Singapore. It was deemed, just too risque.
He actually told me, he said, I can only publish your book if you take out the sex scenes. Says, my God, the novel will fall apart, you know.
I first met Catherine at her luxury apartment complex in a decidedly prosperous part of town. She wanted to show me what she calls her vanity wall. It's where she puts many of the articles and awards devoted to her work. It turns out so much of her fiction is based on the stories she heard during her childhood in Malaysia.
I was brought up in a very conservative background. Taoist, Confucianist setting where females were not supposed to be too self-promoting.
Right.
I remember my mother used to tell me when I was a little girl, don't try to be too clever, otherwise no man will marry you.
You said that you had a Taoist upbringing. For those that don't know, what does that mean exactly?
Mainly ancestor worship, a vague kind, because by that time, some of us were already leaning towards Christianity. But my mother, for a while, preserved the old customs, ancestor worship, for example, and traditions like, very Taoist traditions like observing an important ritual during the a lunar eclipse. I remember as little children, we were wakened at night to bang noisily on pots and pans in order to frighten away the sky monster eating the moon. That kind of thing. And of course, the Taoist world was a world steeped in the supernatural. I grew up, completely familiar with ghosts, ancestor spirits, ghosts all over the world, all over, surrounding us. And they were not benign spirits like your Western elves and fairies. They were rather malicious, malignant spirits, that harmed children, that made them fall ill.
And the spirits, those are family members that have the ancestor worship would be members of your family who've died and are now all around you, and some of them may not like you.
Yes. Well, the ancestor spirits were not the malignant ones. They were the benign ones. Now, I'm talking of those spirits, those Taoist spirits all over. Spirits that were especially jealous and were particularly jealous about male children. Male children were so prized that mothers would be particularly cautious about their male children. Female children, they didn't matter so much. The spirits left them alone because they were not so valuable.
Her big breakthrough novel was also centred on traditional aspects of Asian culture. The Bondmaid told the story of a particular kind of servant girl that really only existed in Chinese culture. It was, once again, a story based in her own past.
You see, I come from a very large family. There were 14 of us. But the persons I remember most of all, my grandfather and my grandmother. And both of them, in a way, inspired my stories. My grandfather, who I think from whom I inherited this love of storytelling. He was an opium addict, always telling stories. But my grandmother...
Sorry? He was an opium addict?
Opium addict.
All right.
A little man, always, with his opium pipe. I remember telling us
Gosh,
incredible stories.
It's a different world.
Wonderful, wonderful stories. But you asked about the bondmaid. Now, my grandmother had bondmaids. There is no definition of bondmaid. In fact, when the book was published, the German version, the French version, the Italian version, they had different titles because there's no word bondmaid. There's no cultural equivalent.
In the Western world.
In the Western world.
Right.
Now, a bondmaid, the Taiwanese would be able to understand it. Taiwanese, Hong Kongese, and the Chinese. A little girl given, not sold to you, just given to you by her mother, by her caregiver, and you could virtually do with her whatever you liked. They lived such wretched lives, many of them.
It's, as you say, there's no sort of cultural translation for the word
No.
bondmaid, but I've seen it described, or that as really being a slave, really.
My grandmother virtually bought them off the doorstep. Not bought them, she would give an ang pao. Ang pao is a little gift of money, as a sign of appreciation. And then she owned them body and soul, gave them new names, checked them in a business-like
So
way.
it is slavery,
Yes,
really.
yes, it really is slavery. In one of the households, there was a bondmaid who had been raped by 3 generations of men. Very believable. Very believable. So if you were pretty, you were 17. If the grandfather was 72, the father was 50, the son was 19, you could be raped by all 3 men. Yes, that kind of tragedy.
And that was happening when you were a girl?
That was happening in Penang.
Go to any bookshop in Singapore now, and her books are prominently on display. But it wasn't always thus. Her short stories may have always been popular here, but in the mid-1990s, when she was trying to get The Bondmaid published, it was deemed too sexually explicit for Singapore, which, as it turned out, was a blessing in disguise.
What happened was that The Bondmaid was an adult novel, not like my little short stories, which could be used in schools because my books were used as textbooks. When The Bondmaid came out, and because there were so many adult sexy scenes, my local publisher, when he saw my script, he was so upset. He said, no, I can't publish your book. So I decided to publish it on my own. I set up my own little company called Catherine Lim Publishing just to publish this one book. And I'm so glad I did. Because when it came out, a cheap little book, and I printed about 2,000 or 3,000 copies, an agent from England happened to see it. She loved it. She appeared on my doorstep and said, could I be your agent? I had no idea what it was. 15 years ago, she became my agent, took my book to the Frankfurt Book Fair, which I'd never heard of. And from then onwards, I became an international writer. So that was great.
After the break, more from Singapore with controversial author Catherine Lim. She's one of her government's staunchest critics, and she's in no mood to be silenced.